In short, conflicts between practitioners and medical faculties, generalists and specialists, and regular physicians and other sects kept the profession badly divided throughout the 19th century. The incoherent strategy of the regular profession's leadership and the weak structure of the organization, the AMA left the field with no sect available to secure undisputed control over the competitive marketplace. Medical school output continued unabated. By the end of the 19th century, the United States averaged one physician to every 568 people. Compared with prevailing ratios in European countries, Germany, with one doctor to 2,000 population, was the favored example. The United States was overcrowded with physicians. Physicians' incomes ran the gamut from poor, $200 a year, to wealthy, as much as $30,000 a year for a small number of elite doctors. The chief complaints of the most prominent professional spokesmen by the end of the century were the surplus of doctors, low incomes, and low social status of the profession. Three underlying problems plagued medical reformers who tried to heal these wounds. First, physicians lacked an agreed-upon technical basis for settling among themselves disputes between the sects. Without public consensus on technical criteria of effectiveness and validity, all sects competed for business in a medical market. But without sufficient public confidence in validity of any one sect, no sect could win a monopoly of medical practice and thereby eliminate the competition. Second, their lack of technical basis for establishing public support put them all in a weak position to establish political control over entry into medical practice. Earlier efforts to use licensing ended in humiliating defeat for the regular profession because of organized opposition from other sects and distrustful public. Third, within at least the dominant sect, different economic interests divided those who practiced medicine from who trained future practitioners. Practitioners wanted to restrict the supply of physicians, and part-time faculty wanted to preserve institutions and that were lucrative additions to their own practices. Incomplete professionalization. Without actually having public confidence in their technical ability, physicians throughout the 19th century and earlier had nonetheless proclaimed norms to support their authority over the lay public. Demands for recognition of regular physicians' technical competence, in which they undoubtedly believed, were the means of legitimating their claims to professional authority. The recognition of that authority, however, was seen as necessary to professions controlling the economic conditions of its work. By proclaiming a set of norms and values associated with their work, regular physicians hoped to end the competitive market for medical services and to win a regulated market for themselves. The basis of professional status and power is still debated by sociologists, who traditionally have posed a set of essential features that are supposed to distinguish professions from a general run of occupations. In 1928, A.M. Carr Saunders, the father of sociology of professions, defined a profession as an occupation, number one, based on specialized intellectual training or study, number two, providing a skilled service to others, and number three, in return for a fee or salary. 30 years later, William Goode stressed prolonged specialized training in a body of abstract knowledge and collectivity or service orientation as the core characteristics of professions. The list of formal characteristics of professions has been extended by other sociologists to include a systematic body of theory, acceptance of the authority of the professional by all who come to him or her as clients, protection of the professional's authority by the political community, a code of ethics to regulate professional relations, and a set of values, norms, and symbols that build solidarity among the profession's members. However, lists of formal characteristics turn out to be fairly useless in the real world in distinguishing professions from other occupations. Even worse, They tend to gloss over the political and economic dynamics that are essential to the process of professionalization, making professional status and power appear an inevitable and desirable feature of modern societies. In reality, as Elliot Friedson had observed, any occupation wishing professional status creates a systemic body of theory, claims exclusive authority of its practitioners, adopts a code of ethics, tries to build solidarity among its practitioners around formal values, norms, and symbols, and otherwise cloaks itself with the well-known medallions of professions to support its claims. If there is no systematic body of theory, Friedson argues, it is created for the purpose of being able to say there is. The commitment to service, argues Harold Walensky, is the pivot around which the moral claim to professional status revolves. Like many such professional norms, there remains no clear evidence that a service orientation is in fact strong and widespread among professionals. In reviewing the sociological literature that makes such claims, Friedson has concluded the blunt fact is that the discussions of professions assume or assert by definition and without supporting empirical evidence that service orientation is especially common among professionals. Indeed, many academics, social scientists have been beguiled by their own, usually self-serving, beliefs in science and expertise into confusing professional norms with the reality of professional practice and motivation. Code of ethics were accepted by some sociologists as genuine efforts by the profession to guarantee competence and honor. Carl Saunders believed that if the foundations of the codes were better understood, they would not be generally regarded with hostility. More recently, some sociologists have approached professional norms more critically. Everett Hughes, for example, argues that the widespread acceptance of norms like the profession should have almost complete control over what he does for the client, and only the professional can say when his colleague makes a mistake, have been used by professionals to hide mistakes. With much of sociological literature ignores in examining the process of professionalization is how essential political power is in gaining and maintaining professional status. As the history of the medical profession in the 19th century demonstrates, without sufficient political power, the profession remains unable to control its economic and working conditions. Initial efforts at licensure were defeated by a popular movement of lay healers and other Jacksonian-era populists. Attempts to use medical education as a strategy to reform were thwarted by the organized profession's lack of control over medical schools. The leading reformers organized a national professional association, but the medical school faculties were beyond the reach of the American Medical Association. Ethical codes articulating prevailing professional norms failed to win public support for the profession and could not overcome intraprofessional competition. With the medical reformers sought was the power to enforce the instruments of professionalism to assure high income, social status, and continued prosperity for the profession. Friedson is adamant in this interpretation of professionalization. Not training as such, but only the issue of autonomy and control over training granted the occupation by an elite or public persuaded of its importance seems to be able to distinguish clearly among occupations, he argues. And the process determining the outcome is essentially political and social rather than technical in character, a process in which power and persuasive rhetoric are of greater importance than the objective character of knowledge, training, and work. The nature of training, as well as the service deal, ethical code, and body of abstract theory constitute a profession's ideology, a deliberate rhetoric in a political process of lobbying, public relations, and other forms of persuasion to attain a desirable and full control over its work. The history of medicine from this perspective can be understood as a political process in which the specific reforms, however much they may increase the technical effectiveness of physicians, are also instruments of persuasion and symbols of legitimacy. The goals of reform leaders were to gain collective control for the profession over its working conditions and economics in order to establish a hierarchy of authority and power among healing occupations, to assure that physicians reigned firmly at the top of the hierarchy, and to assure them as high incomes as possible in any given historical period. Support for such interests would have to come from outside the profession. While efforts were made to win credibility of the public, leaders of the profession did not see their struggle as a grassroots campaign. Seeking a social and economic position above the majority of the population, they could at best hope for the acquiescence of the people. Active support would have to come from the already higher social classes. In the 18th century, practitioners had turned to gentlemen farmers and wealthy merchants in the state legislatures to protect their interests. In the 19th century, a political rebellion from below demonstrated the insufficiency of merely legislated sanctions. Furthermore, political power increasingly rested in a new class in society, those capitalists who controlled great manufacturing and marketing enterprises. These were the men who, for good or bad, were changing the face of the nation. Around their enterprises grew great cities. From their factories came the steel and machines that enabled the same men to unify the country commercially with railroads, products, and even armies. From their corporations came the demand for foreign resources and the product of foreign markets that were rapidly making America a world power. This was the ascending class in America at the end of the 19th century. Those groups in society who connected with their enterprises or their interests could rise with them. It became clear to increasing numbers of physicians that the complete professionalization of medicine could come only when they developed an ideology and a practice that was consistent with the ideas and interests of socially and politically dominant groups in the society. It was desirable that everyone in society recognized their technical effectiveness, but it was essential that the classes and groups associated with the ascending social order believe in their efficacy. The development and increasing dominance of scientific medicine within the profession provided a virtually perfect material and ideological basis for an alliance of the medical profession with other professionals, mainly engineers and lawyers, corporate managers, and all ranks of capitalist class. The medical profession discovered an ideology that was compatible with the worldview of, and politically and economically useful to, the capitalist class and the emerging managerial professional stratum. Medicine as science. Medical research was flourishing in Germany and France during the 19th century, and even in the United States, biologists and physicians made their contributions. In 1818, Valentine Mott, a New York physician, was among the first to attempt major arterial surgery near the heart. Other Americans also attempted new surgical procedures, while some physicians contributed new understandings to internal medicine. The New York Academy of Medicine, founded in 1847, and the Pathological Society in Philadelphia promoted discussion of medical research and science. Few of the findings and developments in medical research were directly useful in improving medical practice. It is doubtful that many patients survived the new surgical techniques in the absence of aseptic practices. While the differentiation of disease made observation more precise, the usual heroic treatments were just as likely to do patient in as before. Beginning in mid-century, medical research in Europe started producing more applicable findings. In 1858, Rudolf Virchow unveiled a general concept of disease based on the cellular structure of the body. From the findings of cell physiology, anatomy, and pathology, Pasteur, Koch, and other medical researchers developed new concepts and applications of bacteriology. In the last quarter of the century, specialized German laboratories began to replace the more generalist botanists, biologists, and physicians. Their findings gave medical science a more reductionist and technically more effective turn. Changes in American medical practice reflected the gradual acceptance of recent developments in Europe. Starting in the 1870s, American physicians flocked to the famous laboratories of German and Austrian universities for a year or more of study if they were ambitious and could afford the expense of travel and living abroad without income. Between 1870 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, about 15,000 American physicians studied medicine in Germany alone. While most American doctors who studied in Europe returned to develop lucrative private practices, a few put their main energies into developing laboratory medical sciences in the United States. Carl Ludwig's Physiology Institute in Leipzig produced several luminaries of America's infant medical science. Henry Pickering Bowditch, one of Ludwig's pupils, founded the country's first experimental physiology department at Harvard University in 1871. William Henry Welch, another Ludwig's pupils, started America's first pathology laboratory at Bellevue Hospital Medical School in 1878. 15 years later, medical science came of age with the opening of the Johns Hopkins Medical School, modeled after the German university medical schools with a heavy emphasis on research in the basic medical sciences. At Hopkins, for the first time in the United States, the laboratory science faculty were to be full-time teachers and researchers, supported by salaries adequate to live on and unencumbered by the distractions of private practice. Virtually the entire Hopkins faculty was trained in Germany. Hopkins and then Harvard, Yale, and Pennsylvania became the indigenous producers of scientific medical faculty. As scientific medicine gained increasing acceptance, medical schools throughout the country vied for Hopkins graduates to add gleam to their lackluster local faculties. Medical practice likewise began to change with the increased acceptance of medical science. Physicians began introducing into their work those scientific medical practices that were uncomplicated and acceptable to their patients, and at least seemed effective in reducing suffering and ameliorating the symptoms of disease. The use of bleeding and calomel began falling off in the 1870s, though many physicians continued to use them on a more limited basis as late as the 1920s. Physicians who had the money to take an extra year's study in Europe were able to build more prestigious practices than the ordinary American-trained doctors. Usually they would take themselves out of direct competition with the majority of physicians by specializing in gynecology, surgery, ophthalmology, or one of the other new branches of medicine. They quickly formed a new elite in the profession with reputations that brought the middle and wealthy classes to their doors. At the base of scientific medicine spread out to include more practitioners. The peaks of elite physicians rose even higher. They quickly found that scientific medicine not only seemed more effective than the heroics of old, it was also more profitable. Professional leaders had tried numerous ways of uplifting the profession during the 19th century, but none of them had succeeded. It was medical science that provided the key to professional reform. Medical science yielded new tools of understanding and held out the hope of more effective techniques of prevention and treatment than orthodox medicine offered. But scientific medicine was utilized by professional leaders beyond merely increasing the technical effectiveness of their practice. It became a well of the ideology of professionalization, used to gain support from the dominant groups associated with industrial capitalism, to cement the complete dominance of healthcare by the medical profession, and to raise the incomes and status of physicians as a group. The obvious advantages to the profession notwithstanding, scientific medicine contained within its seeds the ultimate destruction of the profession. The remainder of this chapter and the rest of this study will examine how this dialectic played itself out. The benefits of profession derived from the adoption of scientific medicine, the contradictions inherent in this historical process that began to undermine the position of the medical profession, and the new forces and contradictions that are now emerging. Gaining public confidence. Scientific medicine solved two broad problems that medical profession faced in the late 19th century: lack of public confidence in the effectiveness of their service, and competition within medical profession. Rather than inspiring awe and confidence, the regular medical profession had won the public's fear and ridicule. To win support and patronage was the major task set by professional leaders during the 19th century. The AMA's Code of Ethics sought to assure the lay public that doctors were ethical and competent, and attempted to command the public to place their confidence in regular physicians. but no claims or commands were effective in the absence of convincing personal experience or persuasive propaganda that could substitute for personal experience. While homeopathy, eclecticism, and osteopathy did not have as much public patronage as regular profession, they had a strong base of support. They had a following, including many wealthy and influential people who believed in their absolute effectiveness. Their practitioners were widely believed to be relatively at least as effective as and certainly less dangerous than most regular doctors. And they did not demand a monopoly of practice, a wise and practical political course given the disreputable condition of the profession and the almost universal reliance on home remedies for most minor, acute, and chronic ailments. For the regular profession to win in the competition for other medical sects, they needed, first of all, to gain absolutely and relatively in public confidence. Scientific medicine provided the basis for a concerted and successful campaign to win this public support. The effort depended on the common folk of America. The campaign for acceptance of scientific medicine was aimed at the wealthy and powerful in society and the new middle classes. Both of these groups owed their privileged positions to the intensive industrialization that began in the Civil War. They were particularly attracted to a kind of medicine that shared their industrial culture, their values, their world outlook, and their ideologies. Scientific management analyzed their labor process and production into its constituent elements and reorganized them under management's control and for management's profits. In a similar vein, scientific medicine analyzed the body into its parts, subjected the parts to the control of scientific doctors, and thereby kept the bodies healthier and more efficient. The germ theory of disease was especially attractive to both the regular profession and these new industrial and corporate elites. The germ theory emphasized discrete, specific, and external causal agents of disease. It gave it encouragement to the idea of specific therapies to cure specific pathological conditions. The payoff for medical practitioners would be increased technical effectiveness and improved standing in the eyes of the public. That was not the foremost concern of either influential capitalists or medical researchers. These men, there were hardly any women in their ranks, saw in scientific medicine the possibility of preventing diseases through the technological intervention that identified an offending organism and its means of contagion and attacked the organism at the source, or used it to create an immune response within the body. Disease was thus seen as an engineering problem, surmountable with sufficient germ theory, and discoveries in bacteriology confirmed the value of their craft and assured increased support of their work. For capitalists, bacteriological investigations and the application of the findings opened the possibility of reducing the toll that disease took on society's resources. The forerunners of scientific medicine, along with practitioners in other medical sects, had already greatly improved the classification of diseases. European physicians had long dominated the field of medical discovery, although now and then an American made a contribution. In 1836, William Gerhardt, a physician at Philadelphia Hospital, clinically differentiated typhoid from typhus, but there was little practical benefit from such classifications when no therapy was forthcoming to cure the condition. Bleeding, purging, blistering, and tonics were the standard bag of tricks available to regular physicians. Homeopaths and eclectics, along with lay healers, used a wide assortment of herbs, and many claimed high rates of cures. By the 1880s, the regular profession still had only a few drugs that were widely recognized to be curative. Quinine could save the victim of malaria, mercury could cure syphilis, and digitalis was successful in treating heart disorders. Digitalis was successful in treating heart disorders. The field of disease prevention was somewhat more successful. In the 18th century, wealthy Europeans and Americans adopted the practice of variolation, a somewhat dangerous inoculation against smallpox used in the East for centuries. In 1798, Edward Jenner introduced inoculation with cowpox that was effective and somewhat safer than variolation. By the time of the third major cholera epidemic in the United States in 1866, the notion that cholera was a specific and contagious disease had finally won near unanimous support from the medical profession, joining the already strong popular belief in its contagion. Medical support for cleaning up the accumulated filth in American cities won the backing of the business class and helped prevent the spread of cholera and high death rates that had characterized the previous epidemics. The success of this preventative effort was credited to sanitary engineering and brought increased support for sanitation programs. Despite the scant results, leading practitioners and the new class of medical researchers sustained their faith in the eventual success of medical science. The major breakthroughs came from Europe in the 1880s and 1890s. In 1883 and 1884, Edwin Klebs and Friedrich Loeffler isolated the germ involved in diphtheria, a major killer in the 19th century. Emil von Behring and his co-workers produced a diphtheria antitoxin in the early 1890s, which, although of little significance in reducing the death toll from diphtheria, supported the belief that deadly epidemics that were born with resignation could in fact be prevented by understanding their causes. These and other discoveries in the 1880s and 1890s were lauded around the world. Medical science benefited with new respect and political and financial support. Success indeed paved the road to fortune. The German government provided laboratories for Robert Koch and Paul Ehrlich. In France, popular contributions supplied a research institute for Louis Pasteur. In England and Japan, private philanthropy paid for new medical research institutes. In the United States, private and government support for medical research lagged behind these other countries. Veterinary medicine received help from the Department of Agriculture to stem epidemics that were wiping out livestock investments. Government officials and philanthropists saw little value in researching human disease, as Richard Shyrock notes, partly because of the nature of medical science prior to 1885 and partly because human welfare brought no direct financial return. Hogs did. End quote. Discoveries of the 1880s and 1890s, however, held out the promise that as science uncovered the germs that caused the great pestilences, further investigation would provide not only cures but methods for guarding against infection and for preventing the spread of epidemics. These expectations guided the lives of medical researchers, but they were also spreading rapidly among the middle classes and those who owned and managed America's new industrial empires. Medical science rescued the medical profession, in particular the practitioners, from the widespread lack of confidence in their effectiveness. These few but significant discoveries, mostly in bacteriology, increased the belief in the technical effectiveness of the profession as a whole. The actual impact of progress against infectious disease was not nearly so great as its proponents claimed. The arsenal of effective weapons against disease did not increase spectacularly, but its little advances did provide the basis for persuading the public that scientific medicine reflected on all members of the profession, practitioners as well as researchers who had been trained in the theory and methods of scientific medical research. The slight increase in effectiveness of the new medicine was embellished in propaganda by the profession and the media. From 1890s on, popular magazines and newspapers joined the leading medical journals in praising the accomplishments and prophesying the future success of medical science. Articles ridiculing medical popular fallacies and extolling the triumphs of modern medicine, and the magazines as well as professional journals. They portrayed medicine as an exact science and physicians as an inquiring and skeptical scientist who avoids hasty jumping at conclusions or too ready to dependence upon formulae. The increased credibility of medicine was important in convincing the public that doctors with scientific medical training had an expertise worth paying for. If doctors could do little more for a patient than an herbal healer or patent medicine, there was not much point in people wasting their money on expensive doctor fees. Scientific medicine wrapped the modern doctor in an aura of therapeutic effectiveness, and the limited improvements gave support to that aura. Furthermore, the technical expertise associated with scientific medicine helped to mystify the role and work of physician more effectively than did older notions of etiology of disease and unpleasant remedies and transparent codes of ethics. Scientific medicine thereby supported the claims of the profession for a monopoly of control over all healing methods. These benefits provided the basis for other gains that were effective in undermining sectarian medicine, midwifery, and other forms of competition. In seeking to destroy its competitors' hold on the medical marketplace, the regular profession proffered scientific medicine as more effective than medicine as an art, and sectarian medicine and quacks. Not only was it more effective, it was, as each sect before it had claimed, the only truly valid medicine. Scientific medicine was held up as the non-sectarian medical theory and practice, the only one based not on dogma but on verifiable truths. As the only valid medicine, it should be granted a monopoly of practice. None but men and women who have the interest in scientific medicine should be allowed to join any county medical society, but making the claim was not equivalent to having it accepted. Folk medicine was still widely used in the United States, particularly in the countryside, but also in the cities. Every family had its traditional remedies and were part of a family lore, believed in and passed down from generation to generation. Generally, the young woman's own family remedies prevailed in her new family. Some of the remedies undoubtedly acted as placebos, but many were certainly effective in providing relief and even cures. Such traditions were effective obstacles to the acceptance of scientific medicine. Most practitioners were also pragmatic, developing a repertoire of skills and utilizing some new techniques that seemed effective and readily accepted by their patients. These country and city doctors were not much impressed by medical science. They saw it as a tool enabling them to heal more effectively when its claims worked and when its techniques did not require a whole new method of practice. Robert Pusey, a Kentucky country doctor who practiced in the 1870s and 1880s, used the clinical thermometer, a sorted specula, and a syringe. Occasionally he used the stethoscope, although he preferred to place his ear on the patient's chest. With this simple method, he could hear and distinguish most conditions as well as his scientifically trained son could with a stethoscope. He used judgments based on practice, read up on cases in the more concrete and concise medical texts, and distrusted journal articles. The older Dr. Pusey vaguely accepted bacteriology, especially as an explanation for infections causing pus, but not generally for infectious diseases. He sometimes used calomel, made and sold his own drugs, did not use patent medicines, and often prescribed strychnine and arsenic as tonics. He practiced surgery in which he used chloroform as an anesthetic and asepsis when the knowledge and techniques became available to him. The propaganda for scientific medicine was sure to be effective, but it would take time. John Shaw Billings, a leading medical reformer in the late 19th century, observed that doctors whose practices were not interfered with by quacks were indifferent to reforms, while those in need of larger practices were more indignant about such competitors. Many quacks had effected cures where science had failed, Billings admitted. But rather than giving him pause in his rejection of any but scientific medical methods, Billings saw it as a tactical problem of persuading the American public that it is in their interest to suppress quackery. The remarkable achievements of medical science were being brought to the public, but Billings cautioned, it is necessary to go slowly and allow such evidence to accumulate. The medical reformers believed scientific medicine would increase the technical effectiveness of the medical profession, and they promoted it as the only effective therapeutic method. Through propaganda, they hoped to undermine public resistance to its use, increase the public demand for it, and thereby force practitioners to join the new non-sectarian medicine.